Late 1967. The Doors stand at the absolute peak of American rock and roll. Their self-titled debut has spent months in the top 5, powered by the incendiary 7-minute opus that becomes the unlikely soundtrack of summer, Light My Fire. Their second album, Strange Days, arrives in September to critical acclaim and massive sales. They're selling out venues coast to coast. Jim Morrison's face stares from magazine covers, his leather-clad image cementing him as rock's darkest sex symbol. But inside the band, there's a growing problem nobody wants to acknowledge. The Doors have been mining the same creative well for 2 straight albums. Jim Morrison's notebooks. Before the band ever signed with Elektra Records, Morrison had compiled what his bandmates called the songbook. Hundreds of poems, lyrics, fragments of ideas accumulated during his years studying film at UCLA and wandering Venice Beach. The first 2 albums drew heavily from this reservoir of pre-existing material. Songs like The End, When the Music's Over, Break On Through, all had been written and developed before the Doors ever set foot in a professional recording studio. Now, in late 1967, as producer Paul Rothchild gathers the band to begin work on their third album, reality hits like a cold November wind. The well is nearly dry. Drummer John Densmore would later give it a name: the third album syndrome. That moment when a band exhausts their stockpile of pre-fame songs and must create under the weight of expectations, deadlines, and their own success. The Doors had released 2 albums in a single year, both drawing from years of accumulated material. Now they had months to create an album's worth of new songs from scratch. The pressure was immense. Their label, Elektra Records, wanted another hit. Radio stations were hungry for the next Light My Fire. Fans expected another journey into Morrison's dark, poetic psychedelia. And the band itself, Ray Manzarek on keyboards, Robbie Krieger on guitar, John Densmore on drums, and Morrison as the charismatic frontman. They expected to maintain the creative momentum that made them stars. But Jim Morrison was changing. The man who once crafted intricate poetry in quiet solitude was now drowning in fame's obligations. The shy UCLA film student had been transformed into rock's most dangerous poet, and the transformation was taking its toll. He showed up to early planning sessions late, often drunk. When he arrived sober, he seemed distracted, distant. The notebooks that once overflowed with ideas now yielded mostly fragments. As 1968 dawned, the Doors entered TTG Studios in Hollywood with one ambitious plan: to devote an entire side of their new album to Morrison's most elaborate theatrical composition, Celebration of the Lizard. Celebration of the Lizard wasn't just a song, it was Jim Morrison's attempt to create something beyond rock music. A 17-minute theatrical piece blending spoken word poetry, musical passages, narrative storytelling, and shamanic ritual. Morrison had been developing the piece throughout 1967. Performing sections of it at concerts where audiences sat transfixed as he wove tales of snakes, ancient rituals, and existential transformation. The composition consisted of 7 distinct sections: Lions in the Street, Wake Up, A Little Game, The Hill Dwellers, Not to Touch the Earth, Names of the Kingdom, and The Palace of Exile. It was ambitious, experimental, and unlike anything else in popular music at the time. Morrison envisioned it as the centerpiece of the new album. The entire first side of the vinyl would be given over to this epic. The title itself came from Morrison's evolving persona. During performances, he had begun proclaiming himself the Lizard King, a self-coronation that was part performance art, part genuine belief in his own shamanic powers. The lizard represented primal consciousness, the ancient reptilian brain that predated human civilization. In Morrison's vision, Celebration of the Lizard would be his artistic manifesto. Producer Paul Rothchild was less convinced. A perfectionist who had guided the Doors through their first 2 albums with meticulous care, Rothchild worried that the piece was too sprawling, too experimental for an album that needed to deliver commercial hits. But he agreed to try, and the band began attempting to capture the lizard on tape. The sessions proved immediately difficult. Morrison, who had always been reliable in the studio during the first two albums, now arrived hours late. When he did appear, he was often visibly intoxicated. The focused intensity that made him such a magnetic performer was dissolving into alcoholic haze. They attempted take after take of Celebration of the Lizard, dozens of attempts. But something was fundamentally wrong. The piece that had worked in live performance, where Morrison's presence and the audience's energy created a theatrical event, fell flat in the sterile environment of the recording studio. The spoken word sections sounded pretentious. The musical passages felt disjointed. The whole thing lacked the cohesion necessary for a recorded work. After weeks of failed attempts, Rothschild made the call. Celebration of the Lizard was being scrapped from the album. They would salvage one section, Not to Touch the Earth, and record it as a standalone track. The rest would be abandoned, though Morrison insisted on printing the full lyrics inside the album's gatefold cover, a memorialization of his failed epic. It was a devastating blow. Morrison's grand artistic statement had been rejected by his own producer and tacitly by his bandmates. The album that was supposed to showcase his evolution as a poet shaman would now have to be rebuilt from scratch, and they had already burned through months of studio time with nothing to show for it. With Celebration of the Lizard dead, the Doors faced a crisis. They needed an album, and they needed it fast. The label was growing impatient. Studio costs were mounting, and the band had precious little new material to work with. So they did something they had resisted. They started looking backward. Rothschild posed a blunt question to the band. Did they have any old songs, anything from before they were famous, that might be salvageable? Densmore mentioned one, a song called Hello, I Love You, that Morrison had written back in 1965 after seeing a young woman on Venice Beach. It had been part of their earliest demo recordings, back when the band was still calling themselves Rick and the Ravens, but they had never considered it worthy of their albums. When Morrison heard Densmore bring up the title, he physically cringed. According to Rothschild's recollections, Morrison dismissed it as just a dumb little song he had scribbled one day watching people on the beach. It was too simple, too pop, too far from the dark psychedelia that had become the Doors' signature. But when they played through it in the studio, Rothschild's instincts kicked in. This was a hit, a #1 hit. The melody was infectious, the structure was radio perfect, and with some studio production, Rothschild layered 10 different guitar tracks by Krieger at various speeds. It could be transformed into something bigger. Hello, I Love You became the new centerpiece of the album, but its inclusion highlighted the uncomfortable truth. The Doors were now recycling 3-year-old material, reaching back to their earliest, most commercial impulses to fill out an album that was supposed to represent their artistic growth. They also dusted off Summer's Almost Gone, another song from those 1965 demo sessions. The bittersweet ballad about fleeting youth carried a poignant irony. The same band that had captured 1967's psychedelic explosion was now singing about summer ending, about innocence lost. It felt like a requiem not just for a season but for an era. To fill the remaining gaps, the band scrambled to write in the studio. 5-1 emerged from a jam session, with Morrison chanting improvised lyrics over Densmore's steady beat, while Krieger and Manzarek followed along. The song's aggressive edge and its provocative line about how the young outnumbered the old captured the generational warfare brewing in late 1960s America, but even this felt more reactive than visionary. The recording process, which had taken days for their debut album, now stretched into months. Every song required dozens of takes. The Unknown Soldier, eventually released as the album's first single, consumed over 130 takes, as Rothschild obsessed over capturing the perfect simulation of a firing squad execution. Joan Didion, the celebrated journalist and cultural observer, visited a Doors recording session at Sunset Sound Studios in spring 1968. What she witnessed would become one of the most famous accounts of Morrison's deterioration, published in her 1979 essay collection, The White Album. Didion arrived to find the band waiting, but Morrison was nowhere to be seen. Manzarek, Krieger, and Densmore sat around the studio, working on instrumental tracks, occasionally glancing at the door. At one point, Manzarek looked up from his keyboard and asked nobody in particular, "Do you think Morrison's going to come back?" Nobody answered. When Morrison finally wandered in hours later, he didn't apologize or explain. He simply sat on a leather couch and closed his eyes. His bandmates didn't acknowledge him. They had learned to work around his absence, to build the music without him, and hope he would eventually materialize to add his vocals. Morrison mumbled something about heading out to West Covina later, but the conversation died quickly. Then, in a moment Didion captured with clinical precision, Morrison lit a match. He studied the flame for a long moment, then very slowly, very deliberately, lowered it toward the fly of his black vinyl pants. It was a gesture that spoke volumes about Morrison's relationship with pain, with self-destruction, with the boredom that had come to define his existence. His bandmates had seen this pattern before, but it was accelerating. The Jim Morrison of 1967, the one who could deliver stunning vocal performances in just a few takes, was disappearing beneath a haze of alcohol. Now he showed up drunk, if he showed up at all. Studio assistants sometimes had to physically support him to keep him upright for vocal recordings. During the recording of 5 to 1, Morrison was so intoxicated that the studio staff had to prop him up to complete his parts. The defiant, aggressive vocal performance on the final track, Morrison snarling about how they had the guns but we had the numbers, was achieved through sheer force of will and multiple takes stitched together in editing. Alice Cooper, then an unknown musician hanging around LA's rock scene, visited the sessions and was reportedly alarmed by Morrison's condition. This was rock's most charismatic frontman, reduced to stumbling through performances of his own songs. The final straw came one afternoon when Morrison arrived late with 3 equally wasted friends who began messing around in the vocal booth, treating the expensive studio equipment like playground toys. Densmore, who had been holding his frustration inside for weeks, snapped. He told Rothschild he was quitting the band, threw down his drumsticks, and walked out. The drummer returned the next day, sheepish but unable to stay away. As he would write in his memoir, he was drawn back because he didn't know any other way to live. But when he re-entered the studio, he felt what he described as the Black Morrison cloud still hanging over the place. When Hello, I Love You was released as a single in June 1968, it rocketed up the charts. By August, it had achieved what Light My Fire had done the previous summer. It hit number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100. The Doors had another smash hit, and Waiting for the Sun was shaping up to be a commercial triumph. But halfway around the world in London, someone was listening to Hello, I Love You with increasing irritation. Ray Davies, frontman of the Kinks, heard something very familiar in the Doors' new hit. Specifically, he heard the guitar riff and vocal melody from his own 1964 song, All Day and All of the Night. Davies' publisher approached him during a tour, explaining that the Doors had essentially copied the riff that had made All Day and All of the Night a hit in both Britain and America. Davies' initial reaction was pragmatic. Rather than immediately suing, he suggested they simply ask the Doors to acknowledge the influence. The publisher's response was revealing. They already have. That's why we should sue them. According to Davies' recollection, Jim Morrison had admitted to the similarity. Whether this admission happened in private conversation or was simply obvious to anyone comparing the two songs, it gave the Kinks legal grounds. A lawsuit was filed, and eventually a UK court ordered the Doors to pay royalties to Davies and the Kinks' songwriting team. In liner notes for later Doors compilations, Robbie Krieger would vehemently deny stealing from the Kinks. He insisted the inspiration for Hello, I Love You came from Cream's Sunshine of Your Love. Specifically, he had told Densmore to emulate Ginger Baker's rumbling tom-tom pattern from that song. But the court disagreed, and the Doors were required to compensate Davies. The controversy revealed an uncomfortable truth about the album. In their desperation to fill out Waiting for the Sun, the Doors had recycled not just their own old material, but apparently borrowed heavily from contemporaries. The band that had once seemed so innovative was now being accused of plagiarism. Davies, for his part, seemed to bear no grudge. In interviews decades later, he would recount the story with amusement, noting that Morrison's admission was the most important thing to him. The most important thing, Davies reflected, is to take the idea somewhere else. By this measure, the Doors had failed. They hadn't transformed the riff into something new. They had simply replicated it with a catchier melody. While Hello, I Love You would become Waiting for the Sun's commercial triumph, the album's artistic soul resided in a very different song, The Unknown Soldier, released as the first single in March 1968. Morrison wrote The Unknown Soldier as America's involvement in Vietnam was escalating and public opinion was turning against the war. But the song wasn't specifically about Vietnam. It was a universal anti-war statement, a meditation on how modern society had normalized battlefield death. The lyrics captured the surreal disconnect of watching war on television while eating breakfast. Breakfast where the news is read, television children fed, unborn living dead, bullets strike the helmet's head. Families sat in their comfortable homes, watching footage of soldiers dying halfway around the world, then continued with their daily routines. The war had become background noise, and the soldiers, the unknown soldiers, had been rendered anonymous. Their deaths reduced to statistics on the evening news. Musically, The Unknown Soldier was unlike anything else in the Doors' catalog. It opened with an eerie organ intro before shifting into a jazzy verse structure. Then, in the middle section, the band created an audio recreation of a firing squad execution, complete with marching drums, shouted military commands, and a gunshot sound effect achieved by Densmore hitting a rim shot on his snare drum. In live performances, the band would act out the execution. Krieger would point his guitar at Morrison like a rifle. Densmore would create the gunshot sound, and Morrison would dramatically collapse to the stage floor, playing dead for several beats before the song erupted into its celebratory coda. It's all over, the war is over, complete with cheering crowds and ringing bells on the studio recording. The song's promotional film, directed by Morrison himself, was even more provocative. It showed Morrison strapped to a pole on a Santa Monica pier, then executed by firing squad. Blood spewed from his mouth. The film cut to actual footage from the Vietnam War, then back to Morrison's body. At the end, his bandmates walked away, leaving their frontman dead on the pier. Many radio stations refused to play The Unknown Soldier, deeming it too controversial, too violent, too explicitly anti-war. The song peaked at only number 39 on the Hot 100, a modest showing compared to their previous hits, but it resonated deeply with soldiers serving in Vietnam, where anecdotal reports suggested the song became an underground anthem among troops who felt like the unknown soldiers Morrison was singing about. The song's power lay in its ambiguity. The celebratory ending, the ecstatic declaration that the war is over, could be heard as either genuine hope or bitter irony. Was Morrison imagining a world free of war, or was he suggesting that only death could end the suffering? Given Morrison's well-documented fascination with death, many listeners heard the song as a dark meditation on mortality itself. The war is over because we're all going to die eventually. When Waiting for the Sun was officially released on July 3, 1968, the commercial response was immediate and overwhelming. The album shot to number 1 on the Billboard 200, where it stayed for 4 weeks, the only Doors album to achieve that feat. Hello, I Love You was dominating Top 40 radio. By every commercial metric, the Doors had created their biggest success. But the critical response told a different story. Reviewers who had praised the dark, experimental edge of the first two albums now accused the Doors of selling out, of sacrificing artistic integrity for radio-friendly pop. Rolling Stone's review was particularly scathing. The magazine's critic dismissed Hello, I Love You as a jagged Kinks ripoff on which Morrison comes out like a rapist, a harsh assessment that reflected both the plagiarism controversy and the song's leering come-on lyrics. The review suggested that the Doors had abandoned the poetic ambition of their earlier work for transparent commercial appeal. Other critics noted the album's uneven quality. Where the debut and Strange Days had maintained a consistent dark psychedelic atmosphere, Waiting for the Sun felt scattered. The gentle balladry of Love Street and Summer's Almost Gone sat awkwardly next to the aggressive politics of 5 to 1. And the experimental chaos of Not to Touch the Earth. Some tracks felt like fully realized Doors compositions, while others, particularly the improvised work song My Wild Love, where the band simply clapped and chanted, seemed like filler. Robbie Krieger would later cite My Wild Love as his least favorite Doors song, recalling a story where a bodyguard told him it was his favorite Doors track. Krieger's response? Oh shit, man. I hate that song. The fact that this throwaway made it onto their most commercially successful album spoke to the creative compromises forced by Morrison's deterioration and the scrapping of Celebration of the Lizard. The album's diversity, which some critics saw as experimentation, others interpreted as lack of focus. The flamenco-influenced Spanish Caravan, showcasing Krieger's classical guitar training, felt disconnected from the album's other moods. The brief seasonal meditation Wintertime Love sounded rushed, and some observers noted Morrison's vocals were noticeably off-key, suggesting he recorded it while drunk. Even the album cover seemed to reflect this tension. Unlike the moody, dramatic covers of their previous albums, Waiting for the Sun featured a bright, almost bucolic photograph of the band against a yellow background. It looked more like a sunshine pop album than the work of rock's darkest poets. The title itself, Waiting for the Sun, suggested hope and optimism that the music only occasionally delivered. Jim Miller of Rolling Stone wrote that after a year and a half of Morrison's posturing, the Doors had failed to deliver on their early promise. The band that once seemed poised to revolutionize rock music now appeared to be recycling ideas and chasing hits. Yet for all the critical disappointment, Waiting for the Sun connected with millions of listeners. The album has sold over 7 million copies since its original release. Clearly, the record-buying public heard something the critics had missed, or perhaps they simply didn't care about the messiness of the creative process, only about the songs themselves. If Celebration of the Lizard couldn't survive as a complete work, at least one fragment proved salvageable. Not to Touch the Earth, extracted from the larger poem, became one of Waiting for the Sun's most interesting tracks, a compressed version of Morrison's shamanic ambitions. The song's opening lines came from an unusual source, the table of contents of The Golden Bough, Sir James George Fraser's massive anthropological study of mythology and ritual. The phrase "not to touch the earth" referred to ancient taboos surrounding royalty and priests, who in some cultures were forbidden from walking on the ground or having direct sunlight touch them. Fraser had documented how these superstitions appeared across many primitive societies, often connected to female initiation rites and notions of sacred power. Morrison had discovered the Golden Bough during his film school years at UCLA, and its exploration of shamanistic practices fascinated him. He saw himself as a modern shaman, using rock music as a vehicle for ancient rituals, and Not to Touch the Earth became his attempt to weave those themes into a rock song. The lyrics painted surreal imagery of class warfare and social decay. The mansion is warm at the top of the hill, rich are the rooms and the comforts there, Morrison sang, contrasting the luxurious lives of the elite with the decay below. The minister's daughter in love with a snake suggested forbidden desire crossing social boundaries. And the song's climax delivered Morrison's most famous self-proclamation. "I am the Lizard King. I can do anything." That line would follow Morrison for the rest of his life. It became both his epitaph and his curse, a boast that seemed to validate his most destructive impulses. If he was the Lizard King who could do anything, then no amount of alcohol was too much, no risk too dangerous, no transgression too far. Musically, Not to Touch the Earth captured the Doors at their most experimental. Manzarek's organ created swirling, disorienting textures. Krieger's guitar work was aggressive and distorted. Densmore's drumming drove forward with relentless energy. And Morrison's vocal delivery alternated between whispered intimacy and full-throated roar. The song stood as evidence of what Celebration of the Lizard might have been, had Morrison been able to maintain focus, had the studio environment not stifled the theatrical elements, had the band not been struggling under the weight of commercial expectations. In 3 minutes and 56 seconds, Not to Touch the Earth delivered a concentrated dose of Morrison's poetic vision, but it also highlighted what was lost when the full 17-minute epic was abandoned. Not every song on Waiting for the Sun dealt with war, class warfare, or shamanic ritual. Hidden among the album's heavier moments were glimpses of the softer, more vulnerable Jim Morrison, particularly in Love Street, his tribute to girlfriend Pamela Courson. Morrison and Courson had a tumultuous relationship that would last until his death in 1971. They fought constantly, broke up regularly, and yet remained magnetically drawn to each other. Love Street captured a rare moment of domestic tranquility in their chaotic romance. The song described the house on Rothdale Trail in Laurel Canyon, where Morrison and Courson lived during the Waiting for the Sun sessions. From their hillside perch, Morrison could observe the street below, the store where creatures meet, as he put it in the lyrics. The song's gentle melody and Courson's presence as Morrison's muse created one of the album's most conventionally romantic moments. But even here, Morrison couldn't fully commit to optimism. The song's final line carried his characteristic ambivalence. "I guess I like it fine, so far." That qualifier, "so far," suggested impermanence, a relationship that might shatter at any moment. It was quintessential Morrison, unable to embrace happiness without acknowledging its fragility. Summer's Almost Gone carried similar themes of transience. The song's nostalgic reflection on a season ending, "Where will we be when the summer's gone?" felt like Morrison confronting mortality itself. The good times were temporary. Youth was fleeting. And despite all their success, something precious was slipping away. These mellower tracks revealed the emotional complexity that made Waiting for the Sun more than just a collection of hits and misses. Morrison was simultaneously at the height of his fame and the beginning of his descent. The album captured that contradiction, the brightness of commercial success shadowed by awareness of its cost. Yes, The River Knows, written by Krieger, offered philosophical resignation wrapped in beautiful melody. The river, a recurring Morrison symbol for time, change, and inevitable flow, knew truths that humans struggle to accept. We can't stop the river's flow, but we can choose how we navigate it. In Manzarek's assessment, the piano and guitar interplay on this track represented the closest he and Krieger ever came to achieving the rapport of jazz legends Bill Evans and Jim Hall. On August 24, 1968, Waiting for the Sun reached #1 on the Billboard 200. It was the Doors' commercial zenith, their only chart-topping album, powered by their second #1 single. By every measure that mattered to record executives, the album was a smash success. But everyone involved in making the record knew the truth. They had barely survived the sessions. Morrison's alcoholism, which had been manageable during the first 2 albums, was now a defining factor in the band's work process. The grand artistic statement they had planned, Celebration of the Lizard, had collapsed under its own ambition. They had resorted to recycling old material and writing in the studio under pressure. The result was their most commercially successful and least critically acclaimed album. Waiting for the Sun established a pattern that would define the Doors' remaining years. Each subsequent album became a struggle against Morrison's self-destruction and the band's inability to recapture the creative ease of 1967. The Soft Parade in 1969 would see even greater outside intervention, with orchestral arrangements that some band members despised. Morrison Hotel in 1970 would represent a back-to-basics return to blues rock, and LA Woman in 1971 would be their final collaboration, recorded with Morrison knowing he was planning to leave music behind for poetry. The album's legacy is complicated. Some modern critics have reassessed it more favorably, noting its stylistic diversity and experimental moments. Stereogum ranked it the third-best Doors album, calling it the band at their strangest, their most exploratory, their most stylistically expansive. Songs like The Unknown Soldier and Not to Touch the Earth have grown in stature over the decades. But Waiting for the Sun remains the album where the cracks first showed, where the image of the Doors as dark psychedelic visionaries gave way to the reality of four musicians struggling with fame, creative exhaustion, and a self-destructive frontman. The album that gave them their greatest commercial success also marked the beginning of their artistic decline. For Jim Morrison personally, 1968 was the year everything changed. He entered it as rock's most charismatic poet and exited it as a full-blown alcoholic whose behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. Within a year, he would expose himself on stage in Miami, leading to obscenity charges. Within 3 years, he would be dead in a Paris bathtub at age 27, another member of the club nobody wants to join. What can we learn from Waiting for the Sun? Perhaps that commercial success and artistic fulfillment don't always align. That pressure can kill creativity as surely as freedom nurtures it. That self-destruction makes for compelling mythology but devastating reality. And that sometimes an album's most important legacy isn't its chart position or sales figures, but the story of what it cost to create. The Doors waited for the sun. But when it came, the light revealed shadows they had been trying to ignore. Their third album, Syndrome, wasn't just about running out of songs. It was about running out of time, running out of ideas, and watching helplessly as their troubled genius slipped toward the darkness he had always been singing about. Waiting for the Sun gave us moments of brilliance. The Unknown Soldier's anti-war theatrics. Not to Touch the Earth's shamanic fever dream. The understated beauty of Yes, The River Knows. But it also gave us a cautionary tale about the price of fame, the dangers of creative pressure, and the thin line between artistic ambition and self-destruction. 56 years later, the album endures not despite its flaws but because of them. It's a document of a band in crisis, creating under impossible circumstances, and still managing to deliver songs that mattered. The music that almost stopped ended up being music that lasted, imperfect, controversial, and utterly human.